Good morning, fellow humanists. My name is Todd Kimball. I'll be your MC today. I remind you that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates for the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society, standing for human rights and social justice. Our reader this morning is Kathy Moyd. Kathy.
Hi, my reading today is from a speech by the first female governor, Barbara Roberts, that she gave in 2006 when she was named, the Human Services building was named after her. I don't know about her religion, but everything she has done and says seems consistent with our humanist principles. The state of Oregon, this is when she was being, the Human Services building was being named after her. The state of Oregon, my native state, and the state of my Oregon Trail ancestors has honored me a number of times with their trust, their support, and their voice. Today, thanks to the Oregon legislature, I am being honored for my long-term belief in the value of human services and for a life's commitment to serving those in need of our help. Being honored in this lasting and notable way is truly humbling. Former US Senator, the late Hubert Humphrey, used to say, the moral test of government is how it treats those at the dawn of life, the children, those in the twilight of life, the aged, and those suffering in the shadows of life, the ill and disabled. To have my name associated with the state agency that meets that difficult moral test every day of every year is one of my life's great honors. It has been over 35 years since I walked up the steps of our state capitol to begin the fight for my autistic son's right to a public education. A low-income divorced mother without child support, I knew personal and economic challenges, but I believed in fairness, in equity, and would soon believe in the Oregon legislative process. That first political success for me not only changed my life, but changed the lives of hundreds of Oregon's disabled children and their families. That first legislative victory taught me that one person could make a difference in the political process. I learned it then, I believe it still. The area of human services would remain always my priority for the disabled, for healthcare, for alcohol and drug services, for the elderly, the terminally ill, for adoption issues, on the challenging needs of the mentally ill, and for abused children and for AIDS victims. Delivering these special services has never been easy and will always be costly. But when others turn away because the needs are too unpleasant or too painful, this agency and its workers and leaders step forward and face these needs every day of their professional life. We owe these professionals our appreciation and gratitude. But as citizens, we can do more. We can make the work just a little easier when we reach out in our political capacity, in our communities, and in our neighborhoods, and carry a small part of the load for a variety of crucial needs. We can ease the load. The opportunities to donate, volunteer, and serve are all around us in every neighborhood in Oregon. It is my hope that whenever people see my name on this building, that they will think of our shared capacity to help the neediest of our fellow Oregonians. If in some way I can help deliver this message, I will have helped earn this honor I have been given today. And I would just like to say that this, oops, afraid you can't see it. But anyway, this the speech is in a book that was just published. I got to go to the release, and it's a lot of her other speeches. And so it's clear that she's been a continuing support of the things she believes in for, up until now. She's now 85, but she sure doesn't act it.
Thank you, Kathy, for a moving and timely reading this morning. Eva Guggemos has entertained and enlightened us twice before. This morning, she will discuss the controversy over the US painter flag, the earliest known US flag created in Oregon, which is housed at Pacific University. Eva is the archivist, an associate professor at Pacific University. She has an MA in history from Yale University, a Master of Library Science from Simmons University and a BA from the University of Kansas. At Pacific, she oversees the archives and museum collections. Her current book is on the Forest Grove Indian School. Let's have a warm in-person welcome from the friendly house, as well as an enthusiastic yet muted welcome for Eva Guggemos.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here in just a second. All right, so thank you, Todd. Thanks for introducing me, and thanks for having me again. As Todd mentioned, I've been here twice before, and the last two times I was here, I was speaking about the legacy of the federal boarding school system for Native Americans. Today, I'm going to be talking about a different topic, although it has some adjacent issues involved. This talk is going to be about this flag. This is a picture of it in the case in our museum at Pacific. So this talk that I'm giving today is a reprise of a talk that I gave a while back in honor of Portland's Textile Month, which is a time when people come and talk to the public in Portland about different kind of interesting textiles in their collections. But of course, flags aren't just any kind of textile. They're really heavy with symbol and meaning. And flags, American flags, they can represent a lot of positive and wonderful things like liberty and justice for all, the republic for which it stands. And so on the reading that we had just before this, you could see connections there with some of the positive things that the state can do. And this flag looks like, if you just know a little bit about it, it looks on the surface like something pretty wonderful. It is, like we said in the intro, one of the oldest flags sewn in Oregon. It dates to 1855. You can just barely see the date that's sewn into the flag there at the bottom. So that's from before Oregon was even a state. But flags can also symbolize negative things, like a flag can be carried as a symbol of violence or a symbol of repression. And so this talk is here to pose a question that I haven't actually fully answered. This is our museum display at Pacific. How do we display an item and interpret an item like this for the public that is, has a meaning that is beautiful, almost like a holy meaning to some people who might visit the museum, but it was created in a context that was terribly unjust. And so I'm going to talk about what that history was. So this is more of a question that I'm posing for discussion rather than one that I have all of the answers to. And I'm going to talk for probably around 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a discussion after that. So I usually start my talks with just placing, where am I in this discussion? Not because it's about me, but just to give some context about where I'm coming from in tackling the topic. And so for this talk, I just want to say that this talk is not about making an attack on the American flag. I love America. I have ancestors going way back. I have many ancestors who served in the military, going back to the Revolutionary War. One branch of my family still has a sword that was given to them by George Washington. Anyway, we have credentials if we're talking about like military service in our family. So this talk is not about all American flags. It's about this specific American flag and how we interpret it. So the flag that I showed on the screen, we know a lot about it, like a lot more than probably is known about most flags that were sewn in the 19th century. So we know about it because early in its history, a person who owned it, T.R. Cornelius, wrote down the history of the flag, including who made it and where it was taken. And, anyway, we know a lot about its context. Some of the things that he mentioned is that the flag was designed by President Marsh of the Forest Grove Academy. So what this means is that the flag was designed by the first president of the university where I work. So that alone makes it kind of a significant item for Pacific. It was also designed by Grandma Brown. He's referring to Tabitha Brown, who was declared the mother of Oregon, pioneer mother of Oregon back in, I think, the 1990s. She's a beloved figure in local history in Forest Grove and also a founder of our university. And the guy who wrote the label also recorded the names of all the women who sewed it. And this is really extraordinary to know. These are women who were students at Pacific. So some of the first female students in one of the first co-ed colleges in the United States, and we know their names. So this is the thing that they made with their own hands. And so this flag has been recognized as special and significant due to its age for more than a century. This is a picture of the flag being displayed in 1897. At this time, Whitman College had it. And you see how there's two labels tacked onto the flag in this picture? I think one of those labels is this very same label that we have today that T.R. Cornelius wrote up. So we've had like knowledge about this flag for a long time. So what is this very interesting and very old flag doing languishing in obscurity in the Pacific University Old College Hall Museum? I say obscurity because this museum is rarely open nowadays. We only have it open by volunteers and often only open once a month. It's actually not been open at all during COVID. So there's really very few people who get to go see this flag, and the university has done very, very little to like publicize its existence. So it's just sitting up there, but hardly anybody knows that it's there. Why is that? When it's maybe the first flag sewn in Oregon that still exists. Yeah, so it says Company D, First Oregon Volunteers, 1855 to 1856. That's a paraphrasing of what it says. And I'll tell you about what all this stuff means in just a second. Okay, this picture might be a little bit blurry, a little low res, but I hope you can see it. So let's talk about why the flag was created, 1855. So this was the flag of Company D, which was a militia company. Militia company that was out during the Yakima War of 1855 to 58. So even as a historian, the Yakima War was not something that I was familiar with. It's certainly not something I think that's taught widely in schools. So let's dig into a little bit about what this war was about. So the Yakima War was a war between Native tribes of the Pacific Northwest and the United States of America. Like a lot of these wars, it was touched off by a broken treaty, the Yakima Treaty of 1855, which was signed at Walla Walla. So this picture that you see on the screen, this is a sketch of Governor Stevens of Washington Territory sitting with some of the tribal representatives at this council where they signed the treaty. Many tribes were at these negotiations, and at these negotiations, they were told that they had to give up most of their lands in order to have peace with the American government. And the Yakima and associated tribes, they resisted signing, but there wasn't really a choice. Ultimately, they had to agree. The treaty, the Yakima Treaty, ceded 11.5 million acres of land that belonged to 14 tribes and bands. All of these tribes were supposed to have 2 years of grace period so that they would have time to relocate to the reservation. I also just want to make a short aside here that Yakima historically was spelled with an I, but the modern tribal nation spells it with an A. So you may see both on the screen. So anyway, they were supposed to have a 2-year grace period to move onto the reservation. But almost immediately, the Americans broke the treaty. Instead of allowing 2 years for the tribes to relocate, Governor Stevens only waited 12 days. So within 12 days, white settlers began flooding into the lands of these tribes that had signed the treaty. And this greatly angered one of the Yakima chiefs, Kamiakin, whose picture is here. He called upon the tribes to rise up and resist. And this is what the modern Yakima tribes website has to say about the beginning of this war. Things moved too quickly, and shortly thereafter, a series of raids, counter raids, and reciprocal atrocities began. This uprising became known as the Yakima War. So according to the tribe, the story is basically that it started becoming a thing where tribes and settlers were raiding each other, and atrocities were committed on both sides. However, as is usually the case in these wars, it was the tribes who got the worst of it. This is a list of who was in Company D, the militia company that carried the flag. So at this time, the US military in the Pacific Northwest only had a really small standing force. And so when something happened, the way that they raised enough troops to deal with it was by raising militia companies, which were just volunteer, units of local residents who would just volunteer to go on a specific campaign. And so in this list, Company D was formed from people who lived west of Portland, more or less in what is now Washington County. And I recognize a lot of the names, a lot of the family names on this list, and I've just circled 2 of them. These are 2 of the people who ended up owning the flag. T.R. Cornelius, he's the one who the town of Cornelius is named after, and William Painter, who his family lived in Forest Grove. But there's a lot of other names on here, if you're familiar with local history, that are going to look familiar. What did Company D actually do? So they're carrying this flag made by the women students of Pacific University. What did they do? So they were supposed to chase down bands of Yakima and Palouse warriors. So they're supposed to be fighting, armed opponents, but in practice, they didn't actually just attack warriors. They attacked many different Native peoples who they came across, including friendly Native groups who were not, weren't resisting. They went on this campaign. This is a drawing of where they went. They went on a campaign north of Umatilla. They were searching for Native people. They were indiscriminate about who they were going to go after. I've only looked a little bit into research on what actually happened. It's quite difficult to track down what a specific company did during this war. So this is the little that I've been able to find out. This is an excerpt from a letter that was written by an unnamed group of Native people to the governor of Oregon, complaining about what was happening. And this is what they describe that Company D was doing. They said, they follow no rule but that of injustice, rapine, and ingratitude. Here's another quote. This is from the US Army. So the militia is like this group of volunteers, but the regular Army officers are observing what's going on, and they are not, the regular US Army officers do not approve of what the militia companies are doing. They describe Company D as having done wanton attacks on the friendly Indians, and they request that the governor of Oregon withdraw the militia from the north side of the Columbia River. The Yakima War ended with a series of terrible executions of tribal leaders. This is one of the monuments about what happened there. And so basically the Yakima War was a war of repression to get tribes to forcibly be moved onto this one reservation. And it's not a it's not a happy event. No matter how you interpret it, it's not a positive event. It's not something that our university would really want to celebrate. Now, the flag was carried again. It was kept by the person who was in charge of the militia company, and they brought it out again in the Bannock War in 1878. This was yet another war touched off by forced relocations of tribes to a reservation. In this case, it was the Bannock tribe, the Fort Hall Reservation in Idaho. And I won't go into great detail about this, but basically what happened is that under the leadership of their chief, Buffalo Horn, the Bannocks left the reservation because there wasn't enough to eat there. And they began just moving out. And that kind of touched off this explosion of other tribes getting involved and tribes moving, trying to link up between tribes who were in kind of the eastern part of Oregon and tribes on the north side of the Columbia River. So once again, the US Army cooperated with militia companies, and Company D was one of those called. The Army and the militia forces chased the tribes north, and the commanding officer of the US Army, who was General O.O. Howard, he didn't want the tribes from the southeast to link up with tribes on the north side of the Columbia River. So he asked some officers to take militia companies onto the Columbia River in steamboats, fit artillery guns onto the steamboats, and patrol the river to make sure that these armed bands couldn't cross. So that's what they were doing with the flag, was going on these steamboats with Gatling guns on them. And what happened, so W.C. Painter was one of the militia members on the steamer called Steamer Spokane, and the Army's own report tells you what they did. They made an attack on an Indian camp. They destroyed it and everything about it, including all canoes. You can notice that they don't really describe the people who were killed. There were plenty of witnesses, though, other witnesses who described what happened. This is an account from a white settler who witnessed the attacks on the Yakimas, who were on the north side of the river and were just bystanders to this whole thing. Their only crime being native and being on the river. They steamed for them, and when in range, opened fire while some were yet in the water. We never knew how many were killed of men, women, and children. And then there were also multiple accounts by Native people. So this is one Native witness to, they opened fire on multiple groups. It wasn't just one camp. So this is a Native person's account. The white people from the Dalles, they all got organized and they got guns and they got a steamboat and went up to the village, and they killed all the old people that don't do nothing, all the old ladies and all the old men, etc. So this is just one of multiple eyewitness accounts of what happened under this flag. All right, so that's kind of the context of this flag, that it was carried in at least 2 violent incidents against Native people in the Pacific Northwest. How do we describe this at our museum, in our museum case? Well, this is the label that has been with the flag for quite a long time. I think this label was written in the 1990s. And if you just read it, you'll notice that there's really not any mention of what this meant. Like, it says that it was carried by Company D in an Indian war. It talks about how the people of Forest Grove felt about the Indian War. It talks about it being an early flag. Does it mention anything at all about what happened to the Native people who it was carried against, or like what, there's no mention in here at all of the Bannock War. Anyway, there's a lot that's being left out in this description. So the central question here is, you know, for us at the, well, for me, I guess, working in the museum, is we've got this kind of very interesting artifact, which has a lot of positive symbolic meaning to a lot of people. But shouldn't we be telling more of the truth, like more of the story about why it was created and how it was used? What does carrying a flag in an Indian war really mean? Should we be talking about the fact that it was sewn by these women students whose names were known? Should we put it away, just not show it anymore? Like, we could keep it in storage and not display it at all? These are questions that we haven't settled, and I would like to open up a discussion on, you know, this is a very tricky question that doesn't necessarily have a right answer. And so I wanted to open up a discussion about how we might deal with troubling objects like this one.
Thank you, Eva, for a very entertaining and enlightening presentation on this. I guess and framing the issue in a very balanced way. I guess I'll start with the first question. I mean, I definitely appreciate and can see where you're extremely passionate about this, and I think you framed the issue very well. My question is, like, how many other people at the university are involved in this discussion? How big an issue is it there?
So you probably won't be surprised to learn that Indigenous issues are of great concern to students and faculty right now at Pacific. There's a lot of interest on campus in Indigenous issues and like social justice types of issues in general. And as far as who's involved in talking about this, we have two different committees that I'm on both. There's one called the Indigenous Engagement Committee, and that is centering around kind of dealing with Indigenous issues. And then there's another committee called the University Cultural Collections Committee, and that's about kind of like museum and art curation issues. And so in both of those, there's a very strong interest in like equity, diversity issues overall. And so I would say there's a high level of interest, but not a high level of awareness of this particular artifact, partly because it's such a prickly question.
I'll read a question from Kathy Moyd from our Zoom audience, and then we'll go to Jeff Strang for a live question from Friendly House. Kathy asks, are there any other relevant displays in the museum about the war and the controversy, or is this the only one?
Excellent question. So the museum overall, I could perhaps, if I give this talk again, maybe I should give more slides on like what is actually up with our museum. But our museum doesn't have a lot of good interpretive, like current interpretive displays in it because it hasn't been staffed with like a full-time curator for many years. And so like the last time that we had a full-time curator was in the 1990s. So a lot of the displays are really dated, and there's really nothing that talks about, we mention Native people multiple times in our exhibits, but it's all done very much from like the point of view of like the university. It's all about the university and like how we were formed, how great it was that we did all of these things, and not a lot about, you know, like, well, who did we push out? Who were the losers in these fights? You know, it's all kind of told from the perspective of like, isn't this great that we have a university, instead of, maybe we should consider these other things.
And now let's go live to the Friendly House for a question from Jeff Strang.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. It seems to me that it would be good to have more of an explanation of this flag, just like we have for World War II relics in Holocaust museums, to explain more of our history. We have our own Holocaust with Native American tribes in the US. So yeah, I think more of an explanation, and I think it's good to keep having that flag on display, because it being the earliest US flag we have in the Oregon, from the Oregon Territory time. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good comment of like trying to provide more context. There is a question, you know, like if we were to take it off display completely, would we be, does that mean we'd be sort of like hiding that part of our history?
John and I found out about a fairly new museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, sometime before COVID, not too long before that. And what was interesting about this museum was it opened up parts of history that a lot of people were not familiar with, and we were not familiar with a lot of it. It focused on not just the roles of the people we read about in the history books, the generals and the founding fathers. It focused on three groups that get little attention. One was what were women doing during the revolution, what was their role. Another was what were blacks doing, what was their role. And the third, I had it in my head a minute ago, women, blacks, and who was the third group, John? I can't, anyway. All this was fascinating new history. And I'm thinking that, and here's where money comes in. I mean, it takes money to do these kinds of things, but it might not be a bad idea to try to work toward a wing that opened up some of these questions that have never been treated. And yes, they need interpretation right there in the display.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to just revise the entire display area of our museum. But like you said, it does take money, and it probably, you know, it maybe shouldn't be me being the one doing it too. But like, both because I'm not sure how I would fit it in time-wise, but also because I think having maybe like additional voices involved in that process would probably be useful.
Kathy Moyne has another comment in our online community. If Pacific was to take it off display, maybe the Oregon Historical Society could do something with it.
They do have another really early flag for a while. This was maybe like 6 years ago or so. They had a semi-permanent display. If you like go in the front door of Oregon Historical Society, you know how there's like that kind of big lobby area that goes like front to back. At the very back of it, they had like this flag up, which had a label that said it was the earliest flag, like the oldest flag made in Oregon, but it was later, this flag. And I think there was sort of a little technicality there, which it was the earliest flag after Oregon became a state. And this one's from before Oregon became a state. And it's also a little bit, you know, it's not exactly an American flag. It's a militia flag. But anyway, I'm sure the Oregon Historical Society would love to have it. I don't particularly want to give it to them because it has such a local, you know, it's sewn possibly in the very building where it is being displayed right now, Old College Hall. And it's so connected to our local community that it would be a shame for it to be taken away to Portland. But on the other hand, if we're not doing a good job of interpreting it, I could see a case for having, you know, another institution do something with it.
I have another question before we get to a comment from John Tellia. We've seen a number of violence, protests over statues and objects that mean things to people. How much do you think Pacific is worried about violent uprising and vandalism if they told the story of the flag in more depth?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the fact that the museum is open for so few hours makes it kind of impractical for, I mean, if somebody were really determined, they could get in and do something, but I think the chances of something like that happening are fairly low. If we were to do something like bring it out on display in a more prominent location, for example, if we did a display in the library, which is open at all times, I could see that raising a lot more controversy. But it would, in my opinion at least, I think it would probably depend a lot on how we were describing it. If we only gave a positive, if we kept the current label, basically, that's on it, or only gave a positive view of what it was about, I think there would be actually a lot of anger on campus about that. With some contextualizing though, I have to hope that people wouldn't want to just destroy it.
And now we have a comment from John Tellia.
Hi, I work for Providence, and Providence has a similar story with Indigenous people. And we're wrestling at Providence of what do we do, because a lot of the memorials are, look at what the sisters did and it's so great, you know, completely forgetting about the monstrosities that occurred. One thing that we've done or that our committees are doing is they're inviting Indigenous people to tell their stories of what it was like when the sisters came to create Providence Healthcare. And I'm curious if the university could invite Indigenous communities to tell their experience and how powerful that might be to see the two different, the dichotomies of, you know, some people seeing this flag as this beautiful masterpiece, while others, it's a reminder of pain and agony and death and destruction. So that's kind of, when you were talking about it, I just was curious if we could invite storytelling or the experience of a group of people that are so quickly shushed in our society and forgotten about. So that's what I was thinking when you were talking.
That's a great idea. We've been making an effort the last few years to do something kind of like that with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. That's whose land that we're on. To kind of like to form a long-term relationship with them that isn't about them like showing up for one event, but you know, that we kind of continue to consult with them and talk with them about things, that we have a, you know, a long-term relationship. That's been something I care about a lot, making sure that that happens. This flag touches so many tribes. I'm sure that the Yakama Nations would be the main ones. And I don't know that we've ever reached out to them. I certainly have not, about the existence of this flag. So I think that's actually a really good suggestion to see if maybe one of the committees that I'm on might talk to them and see if we might be able to find some sort of funding for them to come, to invite them to come and to have some sort of like discussion event with them. That's a great idea.
Okay, now we have a question from Dave DiNucci at the Friendly House.
So I just want to get the big picture here. So the display is up. It has this description that doesn't fill in the gaps that you think definitely should be filled in.
Yeah.
I'm still not clear. Have you petitioned to have those gaps filled in and suggested what the alternate wording might look like? And has there been pushback on that? And if there has been, or if you might expect pushback, you know, is it that you expect that there is a community out there that would find that troublesome to put that kind of description onto the display?
Yeah, okay, so I have not gotten any pushback internally from the university about changing this. I think a lot of people would welcome it. I think the kind of questions we would get would be more likely to be, why don't we just take it off display? Or, you know, should we make a label that's entirely negative? I could actually see it going more that way than the other. What I would be concerned about is that the community that we have on campus is, I'm trying to say this in a way that's fair to everybody involved. In our campus community, on campus, you know, the politics are, not surprisingly, pretty far left, right? Our surrounding community is very heterogeneous. We got a big mix of political, like on the political spectrum. And part of my concern about this is making it clear that we don't want to demonize the American flag or make veterans feel like we are in some way attacking a legacy. I guess that's my concern, is that I want to make it clear that I guess that kind of sums it up, is that I feel like there's a tension between making sure that we are telling the truth, but also not making like current veterans feel like they are being short shrifted or attacked.
Now we have a question from a member of our program committee and stunningly talented MC, Helen Christians.
Todd, you're bad. Anyway, thank you. With the idea that this was a militia, Company D wasn't a regular army. They didn't have a captain or whatever the role would be that was educated in military protocols.
Right.
And not saying that some armies back then didn't do terrible things, but these guys, it sounds like they were really just out of control. Similar to some of the militias that are in our midst today. And I honestly, is there a way that you could present this flag not as an American flag, but as a militia flag that really didn't follow the rules of war?
I think that is a really good point, that it would be a good thing to highlight in the description. I'll just give you an anecdote to tell you another instance where this has come up. So one of the other people who volunteered for these militias was this guy named Joe Meek. And I don't know if that name rings a bell for anybody, but Meek is sort of this iconic Oregon pioneer who helped settle what's now Hillsborough. He was a signer at the Shampooey meetings that helped form the Oregon Territory, you know.
Mm-hmm. The whole thing.
He's sort of this iconic guy. Well, what he did during the Yakima War was pretty horrible. You know, one of the allegations is that he may have ordered the strangling of an entire Native family, including a baby. He's also the person who pulled the rope after some of this. You may not all be familiar with all this history, but you know, the Whitman massacre. The people who took the fall for the massacre, the Cayuse people who did, were hanged, and he was the one who pulled the rope at the execution. So he has all of this. He's a very complicated figure. He's also married to a Native woman. You know, anyway, he's got a really complicated past. And so recently on social media, there's a roadside monument to Joe Meek near Hillsborough that basically says something like, Joe Meek used to live here, and he was such an interesting guy. He was part of the Shampooey meetings, and he was, you know, blah, 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 interesting person. He fought in the Indian Wars. He was a really brave person, blah, blah, blah. So it's just sort of like is all about what a great and interesting guy he was as a pioneer, and says nothing about the negative aspects of his history. So I commented on this in like a local community group about, well, maybe we shouldn't celebrate his participation in the Indian Wars, with at least not without saying what that actually was. Doesn't mean we have to throw out Joe Meek completely as like somebody who we talk about, but we should acknowledge that what he was doing in the Indian Wars was not good. So most of the people who responded to this post were like, great comment, we agree, blah, blah, blah. But there was a minority who disagreed. So there was one guy who wrote in and said like, well, he's part of the military and he was following orders. And so anything, if you're a common soldier and you're told to do something, then, we can't really argue with that. That was the gist of the commentary. It's like, it was a time of war. And in war, things happen. And we shouldn't, take honor away from veterans who served in wars just because bad things happen in war. That was like the gist of their argument. And I felt like this was, obviously I didn't agree with that. I think that war crimes are a thing, and soldiers sometimes do things that are against the rules of engagement.
Right.
And that moreover, as we saw from that one quote, the US Army actually thought that what the militia's doing was horrible and asked the governor to recall them. So there's a lot of things like that I think it's just going to be perhaps difficult to get that message across to some people who really people who were really set on protecting one point of view. It may not matter how much we explain, but I guess we don't necessarily have to cater to them either.
Right. And we as a society have been catering to them for decades, for centuries. Now, I'm not talking about soldiers here. I'm talking about all the nutty things that are going on in this world. Well, it's, they're Christians, they're Americans, we've got to be kind. There's got to be a time where we stop saying no more. And you're in a tough spot because you're in the front lines of that.
It's tricky.
It is tricky.
For
Thank
sure.
you. Thank you for your story and for your answer.
I see Jeff at the mic at the Friendly House, and I'll get to you shortly, but Hank Robb has had his hand up for a while. Hank, go ahead with your comment or question.
Well, mine is kind of a follow-up, and it's really just sort of a historical interest. As has been pointed out, this is a it's not even a state yet. It's a territorial militia. The federal troops, the federal government has no say about what these people do. They can't order them around. Why are they not carrying a territorial flag?
Yeah.
I mean, why are they carrying a flag of the United States to begin with? That's not who they represent.
Right.
That is a good point that I hadn't even really considered. Yeah, they were under the command of the governor of the Oregon Territory. And then the governor of the Oregon Territory somehow attached them. I'm not a military historian, but just looking at various cases that I've seen, this seems to be what happened often, is that the militia would be formed out of local volunteers, but then they would be attached to an army commander.
Okay.
And so like during the Bannock War, there was an army officer was in charge of the gunboats, but the people under him on the gunboats were militia. And so there is a tie in between the two, but the army commanders weren't always, especially during the Yakima War, they may have been supposedly in command of the militias, but in practice, the militias were just off doing whatever they wanted, apparently. I mean, they didn't seem to be listening to anyone's orders.
Well, in current parlance, people talk about federalizing the National Guard, and then the federal bureaucracy has charge of the state National Guard. And I'm speaking of the National Guard because that's my understanding. That's what happened to all those militias. but before they're federalized, then they're not under federal control. They're under state control. And in this case, they're under territorial control. It doesn't sound like they were attached to anybody. They were out doing whatever they were doing. No federal officer assigned these people to take that steamboat and go kill these people.
Well, in the case of the Bannocks, that was an order of General O.O. Howard, who was in charge of the Army of the Columbia. And then to fill out, they didn't have enough regular Army, privates or whatever to do everything that they needed to do. They had a pretty small standing force. And so they took these militia volunteers and put them under the Army officers. But, your point, I understand it. Legally, I don't know that they really had, I don't know whether they were supposed to be following what the Army officers were doing or not.
And sort of one other thought is, do you think this had something to do with people who were pushing for statehood and somehow wanted to fly their "we want to be a state"?
Well, so why these people volunteered for the militia? Is that what you mean? Like, why did they go off?
Why did they have an American? Why did they have an American flag when they weren't an American force?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it was the president of Pacific University and the local women who decided to make this flag. They decided. I don't know that they were told by anybody to do it. They may have just said, like, well, if we're going to have a company, we need to have a flag. And I don't know that there was anybody higher up involved in that decision.
Thank you for your response.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, let's go back to the friendly house for a question from another talented MC and valued member of our audiovisual committee, Mr. Jeff Strang.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. So I'm wondering if Pacific University has any kind of positive reparation type program in light of the history with Native Americans and European Americans taking over. Like, do they give a 50% scholarship to enrolled members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde or other Native American tribes?
As far as I know, they do not do that. And there's been a lot of talk the last couple of years about how something like that should be perhaps instituted. Most of you probably know that whatever the sticker price is for a university, the basically 99% of the students don't pay the sticker price. Like, most students pay about 50% of the tuition anyway. And so I don't know that you even make a huge difference financially to the university to just say right off the top, we're gonna give a 50% discount to tuition for tribal members. We don't do that. We do have other things that we've been working on the last few years. It's not like this issue has not been thought about at all, and it certainly is cared about, but the specific thing of scholarships has not been addressed. Some other things that we're doing are returning artifacts that have been in our museum to the tribes of Grand Ronde. We are working on getting more aspects of tribal history and indigenous issues into our curriculum. We're trying to invite tribal members to campus more often. We have a lot of activities that are happening now in November for indigenous, I'm going to get it wrong. It's the Indigenous Heritage Month, but it has a slightly different name. That's in November. Anyway, there are things happening, but the scholarships thing is one that I think some more action could be done on.
We'll go back to our online community for a question from Suzanne.
Hi there. Thanks, Eva, very much for communicating so well the story. My question is, you as the archivist there, do you have more of a responsibility to take charge? And do you feel the need to tell the whole story? Is that what an archivist aren't they supposed to do that? And then do you have some power? Do you have some ability to be able to move in on that?
Yeah, so as far as like where my position is in all of this, archivists are usually involved with more with papers, so like art documents, documentary evidence. And so a lot of what I do on a daily basis is more like take in records, organize records, or oversee other people doing it, digitize things. The museum is kind of an oddball for our institution because we have the archives, which are in the library, and then we have the museum collection, which is in a historic building on campus. And the museum has been sort of orphaned in our administration. When we lost the last full-time curator in the 1990s, that position was never rehired. And responsibility for taking care of the artifacts and displays was just sort of put on pause for a very long time, like for financial reasons. They just couldn't afford to hire enough people to really curate the collections. And so it's been in kind of a arrested state, like from circa 1998 to the present. So a few years ago, I and other people were very concerned that, for example, we didn't know what we had in the museum because the only catalog was in a locked file cabinet in the museum where no one works. And so I got involved in the museum by basically saying we need to catalog this stuff, but I've never been given responsibility for the display part of the museum. So like I work on the kind of behind the scenes cataloging and making sure that we know where things are. The display of items in the museum has no one responsible for it currently. And so I could actually go in, no one would complain. If I just went in and took that label out of the case and put in my own, people would be like, yay. There's a certain part of me that is like, should I be doing that work unilaterally though? Like, especially when I'm not being paid to do it. Like, it seems like it should be something that is actually being paid for by the university, somebody to revise these things. But I may just go in that particular label. I think I may just go in and change to get rid of it.
It seems like all these questions may have inspired you, Eva.
Yeah.
I'll read a couple of comments in the chat and let you comment if you so wish. This is from the entire Keystone Room audience at the Friendly House in a sort of focus group collaboration. Like American
I'm using you all as free consultants.
So this is from Mike Boucher. Like American free thinkers regard Thomas Jefferson, we celebrate his efforts for religious freedom, but condemn his slave owning.
Yeah, good parallel there. That I think that's actually a super hard needle to thread, right? How do we, like I've visited his home and it's hard. The whole house is wrapped up in the history of slavery, and how do you celebrate the good parts without overlooking the very substantial bad parts of that history? I think it's hard. I mean, that is the kind of model I think we're going to have to look at, though. Yeah.
And I have a recommendation from P. Leslie Haggard. They say, I recommend Gail Oko Thunders over the Ocheko 5-volume series. Ava, are you familiar with that?
I am not. Maybe she has more to tell us about what this series is on.
Sure, we'd love to see more about that on the chat, or if they would like to come on and give a further comments. But as we wait for that, I will scroll down here. We have another question from Kathy Moy. Were there any activities by Company D in the Forest Grove area?
So the Forest Grove area was always very peaceful. it's part of why settlers gathered there to begin with, is that the local Native people were the Tualatin Kalapuyas, or the Atfalati. And by the 1850s, they only had, because of successive waves of epidemic disease, the tribe only had around 60 or so members left in the 1850s, and they were never involved in violence. They had some disputes with white settlers, but there was never any like thought that they were going to rise up. That didn't stop the people in Forest Grove from worrying that they might be attacked. I think they were more worried about people coming from Washington Territory down into Forest Grove. And so when the Yakima War was about to break out, that time period, 1855 to 56, for those of you familiar with Native American history, that was like the key time for treaties and removals. 55 to 56 is when all of the tribes in the Willamette Valley were forced to sign treaties and then forcibly removed to reservations. And so I think there was a lot of anxiety in Forest Grove that tribes either in Washington or in the Willamette Valley would somehow link up and rise up. And so there was like they made sort of like a fort in Forest Grove. There's a little detail about it on the original museum label. They made like some sort of picket line. Anyway, they were worried about it, but I don't think that the militia company ever actually did anything around Forest Grove because there was no military action happening in that area. Long-winded answer, sorry.
Oh, that was great. That's very informative. We have another question in chat that I'll read from Helen Christians. Is there a Native museum that might be interested in displaying the flag as part of telling their story?
So I think that one actually hooks up with the earlier comment. I can't remember now the name of the speaker who was suggesting it, but about talking to, basically getting connected with people at the Yakima tribes to see if they might like to come and visit us. I could also see us arranging something like a loan if they were interested in at some point displaying it at their own in their own museum. I think that's interesting. We are repatriating artifacts, like artifacts that were made by Native people. We're trying to repatriate them to the appropriate tribes. This object I think would require more consideration before we did that, because it was made by families that are deeply connected to the university in Forest Grove, even though it's about an event that happened on tribal lands. Anyway, I'm not answering this very well, but basically I'd have to think about, like, if we were considering a permanent transfer, that would probably require a lot more talking, but a temporary loan, I think we would welcome that.
Sounds good. I think we've inspired some collaboration this morning. We have a question from Jamila in our online community.
Thank you very much, Eva. I've always enjoyed your presentations. The story that you told about the militias and the horrible actions that they took reminds me of a book I read a little bit ago called The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. You're probably familiar with it, where it recounts very, very similar stories of militias or just gangs of white settlers going out to basically murder indigenous peoples. And so, I would hope that whatever story gets done with this flag would include that context, right? In other words, it wasn't just something that was done against the Yakima tribes. That was part and parcel of a story that had gone on for centuries. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
It's absolutely true. And that it's part of a pattern. It's not just one incident. I mean, the flag was carried into at least 2 different wars over very similar issues. Yeah, I think that's a really fair comment. I might end up with a label that's like 5 pages long in order to get all of these things in. I think what, from talking with you all and also the talks I had during Portland Textile Month, I mean, I guess at this point, what I'm envisioning would be really great is if we didn't just have it in a flat case by itself with like one label, but if instead if it were kind of like part of a display about the time of treaties and removals, like the 1840s and 1850s, and what, because this is in Pacific's University Museum, relating that to, what was Pacific's part in this? How did we contribute to the removals? How did members of the Pacific community contribute to these wars? Having it be more than one object that we're discussing.
As I wait for final questions, I'll point out that in the chat, we have a link to the book by Gail Onkyo Thunder. So you can check that out. And remember, you can save the chat links and resources by clicking on the 3 dots and clicking the Save Chat button there. And as I wait for final questions, I'll ask one question, because the one thing that came out of this today is we're all much more fascinated by the Forest Grove Museum there. I know it has limited hours of being open, but how can we see it? Tell us about that.
I think, so just for this group here, if you guys were really interested in seeing it, anybody here in the audience, you could contact me and we could try to set up an appointment. The reason why I'm being kind of hedgy about this, I've alluded to the fact that like the university has not paid for anybody to actually be the curator. And so I'm really hesitant to volunteer to basically be on my own time with curating the museum for the public when the administration so far hasn't, come up with the money to actually pay somebody. It's not when you work for a nonprofit, this is a common problem where everyone sort of wants you to do a lot of things for free because they're in the public interest. And I'm sympathetic to that, but at the same time, I strongly feel the university actually needs to invest some money in providing, for the last 25 years, the museum has only been open because we have volunteer docents, and we had a specific staff member who just retired, who was very dedicated to working with the docents and opening the museum. Since that person is retired and the university has not sunk more money into refreshing the exhibits or providing public access, I'm hesitant to just be like, oh, I'll fill the gap with my Saturdays. So if you personally are interested in learning more, you can email me and we can see what we can do, but I'm not putting it out there for everybody that I'm committing to, being the new docent coordinator.
I think you've created a pretty strong resume tape during our discussion today to be the new docent coordinator, Eva.
If they want to pay me for that. So.
This was outstanding today. You generated tremendous discussion. Your presentation was outstanding. It is great to see you today. We always enjoy having you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you.
And use you all as my focus group.
Absolutely. We do have afterthoughts where the members talk about anything and everything going on in their worlds starting at 11:30. You're welcome to hang out with us, but you've certainly performed more than your share of duty today, and we really appreciate your time.
Okay, well, thank you all for having me, and hopefully I'll see you again.
Thank you.